On the 18th of July 2018, we set off from the Royal Harwich Yacht Club for a short trip to Holland. In the past we've gone straight to Vlissingen, but that's about 100 miles, which means an overnight passage to avoid arriving in the dark. That was never a pleasant option, and it's got even worse now with the number of wind farms off the Belgian and Dutch coasts. We were opting for the soft option of heading south to Ramsgate and then making our way up the Belgian coast. Crossing the Thames estuary can also be tricky, but we've done that trip so often we could probably do it without a chart in good visibility. These days our preferred option is to use the route shown in red. The critical thing about crossing the estuary is to have a fair tide around North Foreland. Heading north and leaving Ramsgate on the first of the north-going tide, you can expect to have it underneath you for nearly 8 hours. But heading south, you only get about 6 hours of favourable tide. So there is no option but to stem the tide on the way out to the Gunfleet, and then take the first of the flood down East Swin and Black Deep. We round the Gunfleet close in to the 5-metre contour, then head south towards Barrow number 2, where we turn at right angles to Sunk Sands and cross it with plenty of water to spare. Yeah, we're almost over the edge. Once into Black Deep, you can head either for Fulger's Ghat or Fisherman's Ghat. We used to use Fulger's Ghat, but after the London Array was built, we tend to use Fisherman's Ghat, as it's easy to get disorientated once in the farm. And with the tide underneath you in Black Deep, and cutting across the shallows by the radio mast, it only adds 10 minutes to the passage. We now save far more than that by crossing Sunk Sands off Barrow number 2. Having left Fisherman's Ghat, you can head between the Thanet Wind Farm and North Foreland. But you still have to cross the shipping lanes, which can be complicated because much of the traffic is doing a right angle turn to enter or leave the estuary. Although it looks a clear run across on Google Earth, in practice there are a whole variety of obstructions, made even worse in recent years by the new Belgian and Dutch wind farms and the routing lanes around them. Our plan for the next day was to head north of the good winds, across the shipping lanes by the Sindati Bank, and then straight across the offlying sandbanks to Newport. In the calm weather, we weren't expecting those banks to cause us a problem. It was an early start to catch the first of the east-going tide. The tide changed almost as soon as we got across the shipping lanes, but there was enough wind to still give us nearly 6 knots ground speed towards Newport. was still enough rise of tide to cross over the banks, but we did skirt round the shallowest patches. The marinas are at the end of a long channel, and we chose the one on the right hand side of the channel, being close to the clubhouse and nearest the supermarkets. We'd raced over here before, but never had the chance to look around, so we took the next day off to wander around the town and see the sights. Our next leg was to be just a short hop up the coast to Blankenberg. It was easy to find Blankenberg, as it lies immediately west of the massive breakwaters of Zeebrugge. It proved to be a major Belgian holiday resort, with matching supermarket and restaurant prices. The layout is similar to Newport, with a long canal run-in and the marina split into two parts, the right-hand fork being significantly cheaper as it's further from the town. We found only one other British boat in there. Presumably, all the other British boats have been frightened off by the red diesel debacle. Early the next morning, we caught a train into Bruges for a day's sightseeing. The next stage was to cross the Scheldt Estuary and enter the canal system at Vlissingen, go straight past Middelburg and find somewhere to moor up in the Veerse Meer. By the time we reached the entrance to the marina in the centre of Vlissingen, the tide was hoovering out at over 3 knots. And it took quite a while to go the extra mile or so to the entrance to the canal system. Chandler's, wasn't it? We entered the Veerse Meer at Veer, and then headed down the mere and found a mooring on the smallest southern island. It was just as well we stopped at this end of the pontoon, because later on swimmers were walking around only waist deep at the far end. The plan for the next leg was to head east along the Veerse Meer, lock out into the Oosterschelde, turn right for about 1.5 miles and then lock in again in the canal to Hoos. Out in the Oosterschelde there was quite a brisk tide running, and in the distance you could see the Zealand Bridge with the opening bit at the far end. Although there's a marina on the outskirts of Hoos, the centre is a pleasant little spot, and you can use the sailing club, which was almost opposite where we were moored. The next day we essentially retraced our steps. We had a look at mooring up in Veer, but it was too crowded, so we went back and found a mooring almost opposite where we'd been 2 nights before. These have to be the smallest apartments anywhere, unlike those just down the canal at Veerse Meer, where every house has road access to the front and a mooring at the rear. The next leg was to just be a short trip, back up to Veer, down the canal to Middelburg and moor up for the night. At Middelburg, we flushed out the holding tank, which had been causing problems, then moored up outside the bridge, ready for an early morning start, before heading off and have a look round the town. The plan was to get down to Newport the next day, and to make the most of the tide we needed to catch the first bridge opening, which was 6:30 local time, 5:30 UK time. Unfortunately, When we got to the bridge, we were advised that it was stuck due to the hot weather, and that it wouldn't be opening until at least 10:30, when a commercial ship was due through. If it didn't open then it wouldn't open that day at all. At about 8:30, the lifting bridge on the far side of the swing bridge opened, and a big ship emerged, and then stopped. Shortly afterwards, a tractor arrived towing a muck spreader. The driver kicked the hosepipe into the canal and began sucking up canal water. When the tank was full, the driver drove backwards and forwards over the bridge, emptying the contents onto the roadway. He then came back and filled up again. He repeated the process 3 times.
That water doesn't look very nice, does it?
Once he'd finished, they waited for about a quarter of an hour before trying to open the bridge. It worked. When we finally got out of the canal, the tide was already flooding strongly, so it was a long, slow process getting down the coast. Aside from dodging the shipping, we also had to try and keep clear of the Breskins ferry. When we got past Zeebrugge, it began to cloud over, and by the time we got to Ostend, lightning was flickering around the horizon. When we finally got into Newport, it was absolutely tipping down, the first rain they'd seen in weeks. The weather for the next day, Sunday, looked terrible. It didn't look much better on the following Monday either. Rather than trying to sail on the Sunday, we caught a tram along the coast to look at the Atlantic Wall, the German World War II fortifications. As our tram passes were valid all the way up the coast, once we'd finished looking at the Atlantic Wall, we caught the tram again up to Ostend to get lunch. By Sunday evening, the forecast for the Monday had improved considerably, with only a small windy patch in the middle of the channel. As that wind would be slightly from astern, we decided to give it a go. When we set off, The wind was from directly astern, and so light we had to motor sail to make any progress. Eventually the wind speed built to give us enough boat speed under sail alone. Gradually the wind came round onto the beam, and then increased to over 20 knots, causing us to reef for a couple of hours. Overall, it had been an uneventful passage. We arrived at Harwich with a bit of daylight to spare, and we enjoyed a final hour sailing up the river into the gathering twilight.